Dawn came low and heavy over the Gunnison. After 3 days of rain, the river moved like a thing with its own breath thick and fast, shoving logs along its back, slapping white against the black rock of Raven's Bend. Reed Calhoun stood on the rim where the pines thinned. His coat was dark with wet, his hat brim ticking with drops. There was a copper taste in the air. Mud sweetened the smell of crushed sage. Across the current, a line of figures came down a cut in the bank. They moved in single file, faces painted in ochre and ash. The men were night runners. In the center, 2 of them carried a woman on a litter of willow. A deer-hide blanket wrapped her to the shoulders. Her hair hung long and black and tangled with rain. The elders behind them sang in a low drum, not loud, just steady like a hand on a chest. Reed felt his fingers find the old scar at his temple. It itched when he watched the river. It burned when he watched fire. The men halted at a tongue of rock that reached into the flood. One elder stepped forward and lifted both hands to a sky the color of pewter. Reed could not catch the words, only the cadence river against voice. Then the woman moved. A small turn of the head, a flinch at the shoulders. The blanket fell from her legs. They did not move at all. "Don't," Reed said to no one. The elder's hands came down. The men lifted. Reed was already running. He slid loose gravel under his heels, shoved through young pine-punched cedar smell from wet bark. Cold air cut his throat. The river grabbed the girl and swallowed her without a sound. He hit the water half a beat later. It took him, rolled him. The cold was a wall. His ribs felt like glass. His hat went. The world turned into green and white and stone. He clawed for the surface and found air that hurt to breathe. He spun in the current eyes, burning mouth tasting iron and silt. An arm broke the water 20 yards downstream, then sank. Reed kicked hard. Something slammed his side and lit a hot wire up his back. He found hair, then deer hide. He hooked his forearm across the woman's chest and let the river shove them both toward the inside bend where the flood had bitten away a bar of sand. They hit gravel. Reed dragged until the water slipped off their bodies and left them in a new wet. He coughed into the sand. He rolled her to her side and pressed between her shoulders. Water came. She choked. She fought for breath, each inhale a small knife. Her eyes opened. The whites felt too bright against the storm. She watched him the way a deer watches a hunter who has lost his rifle. "You are safe," he said. The lie was in the wind and she heard it. She looked down at her legs and knew what he already did. "Why?" she said. Her English carried the shape of other sounds. "Because I could." On her upper arm, a ring of tattooed dots circled a small sun. The mark tightened Reed's chest. The mark tasted like smoke. The mark had a name he did not say. Night Runners. On the far bank, the elders had stopped their song. One lifted his palm toward Reed, and the woman then cut the hand flat through the air. The gesture had no sound. Reed read it anyway. She was dead to them. He stood, pulled the woman into his arms, and felt his ribs crackle when he breathed. She was light in the wrong way, cold as river stone. He began the walk along the bank, looking for a ford shallow enough to take with the weight of a second heart against his chest. The ford at the cottonwood was thigh-deep and fast. His boots slid on round stones. He went sideways, looking past the far bank rather than at it, keeping his feet when the current shoved. He spoke to her without meaning to. Things a man says to a horse on bad ground. After that, there was the long climb to the lip of Raven's Ridge and the squat line of his cabin in the trees. Inside, the air smelled of wool and ash. Reed knelt by the stove and choked flame from banked coals, then hung the kettle. Steam raised damp from his coat. He found a shirt in the trunk and laid it on the cot. He took a blanket and made a wall between his eyes and her skin. He unknotted wet buckskin with careful hands. He did not look. He changed her with a respect that felt like penance. The skin at her lower back was bruised and flat in ways bone should not be. When he pulled the blanket up her shoulders, she shivered and held it tight with both fists. He saw her eyes taking in the room, the rifle above the door, the saddle in the corner, the iron-rimmed chair by the wall draped in canvas. He saw her stop on it. The chair had made him walk when a horse rolled on him 3 winters ago. He left it in the room to remind his body what it owed. Now it sat like a kept secret in plain sight. "You hate my people," she said, not a question. Reed glanced at the nail by the door. A small pouch hung there, beaded old soft from hands. Sage and cedar and tobacco made a thin smell in the damp. He had not thrown it away. He had not used it. "I hate what I have done," he said. Her mouth tightened, then eased. She pulled the blanket closer. The kettle ticked. Rain clicked on the roof like tiny bones. "My name is Nia Blackbird," she said after a time. "Reed Calhoun," he said. "Your land," she said the words careful. "Your river." No, Reed said. No one's river. A horse snorted outside, then the sound of boots on boards. Someone laughed under his breath. Reed's body stood before he did. He slid the rifle down, checked the gate, and laid it across his knees as the latch lifted. 3 men came in as if they could not feel the rain. Vance Cotter smiled with one side of his mouth. Jeb Lang had a coat too short for his arms. Hollis Crane wore a scarf white as the inside of a church. They looked once around the room, and then twice at the woman on the cot. "Morning, Reed," Vance said. "Hell of a flood." "Not here for the weather," Reed said. "Luther wants a word," Jeb said. "There was a spot of trouble north. Cattle gone. Shots on the ridge. You could be useful, seeing as how you used to follow sign for a living." Hollis lifted the scarf a little, smelling the room. "Looks like you already got trouble." Reed kept his face quiet. "I did not ask for company." "You never do," Vance said. "Prospect Bend is asking anyway. Bring your rifle. There is pay in it. 20 ahead." "I'm not interested." "Then he will come to you," Hollis said. He stepped toward the door and his heel struck something. He looked down and laughed through his nose. A cigar tip rolled on the plank brass cap bright in the light. The letter C was stamped neat in the metal. Hollis nudged it with his boot and left it where it lay. The men went out without another word. Their boots knocked mud from the steps. Their horses rattled bits. Reed sat very still until the rain took their sounds. He picked up the cigar tip and turned it once, then set it on the shelf by the stove. He fed the fire and watched the flame take. Naya watched him. Her eyes were not soft. "They will come back," she said. He did not answer. He poured coffee into a tin cup and took one sip. It tasted like burned rope. He handed her water. She drank slow. Her hands shook only a little. "Try the chair when you are ready," he said. "There is slope to the floor. Watch that." She nodded once. He stepped outside to see to the horse. The wet hit him in the face like a cold hand. Onyx lifted his head over the stall door and blew steam into Reed's neck. The smell from the hay rack was warm and sweet. Reed worked without needing to look at his hands. He listened. The rain, the creak. The particular silence that comes when men are watching and think they are not seen. Lightning went long across the ridge and through the clearing in white. For a half-breath, 2 figures stood on the slope above the cabin. Broad hats, shoulders turned. When the dark came back, it came fast. Reed waited. The smell of cigar smoke arrived late, thin and oily under the rain. Inside, Naya had pushed herself up on an elbow to see through the small pane by the door. The glass shook in the wind. Out in the gray, she caught the pin red of a coal as someone drew on a cigar and then covered it with a hand. The coal bloomed, then died. She let the blanket fall and pulled it up again, eyes on the glass. The river kept its voice. The roof kept the rain. Outside, the slope stayed empty. The rain eased toward morning and left the trees dripping. Reed slipped the bar on the door and came in with the wet on his shoulders. He set the rifle by the jamb and listened. The cabin held the soft sounds a place makes when it is lived in. The stove iron ticked. Water tapped the pan beneath the window. Naya lay awake, head turned toward the glass eyes, steady. "You saw them," Reed said. She nodded. "Two. They smoked and hid the coal like boys who stole meat." "They are not boys." "No." He fed the fire and set coffee on the grate. The air took a dark smell that reached the back of the throat. He fixed the blanket around her shoulders and pulled the canvas off the old chair. The iron rims were clean. He had oiled them the last time he moved the thing, and that had been months ago. "You can try it when you want," he said. "The floor runs toward the door. Keep a hand on the wheel." She looked at it, then at him. "I will not be carried twice." "I figured." They did not say more until the first cup was poured. He drank fast and did not make a face. She took water again. The tremor in her hands was almost gone. He lifted the trunk lid and found a dress he had folded without looking at since winter. The cotton had faded to a softer blue. He set it on the cot and kept his eyes on the kettle lid while she changed. The blanket made a screen that fluttered at the bottom where it did not reach the floor. When she said she was decent, he turned. The dress was too big through the shoulders and waist. She had tied it with a strip of cloth and turned the cuffs. The color made her skin look warmer. "You can mend," he said. "A woman who cannot sew dies cold." He rolled the chair closer. "Let me help." She could have refused out of pride. She did not. He slid one arm beneath her shoulders, the other under her knees, and lifted while she pulled. Together they found the chair. The wheels creaked and then settled. She set her hands and rolled backward and forward, testing weight steering with fingers and palm. The chair fit her like a tool. He opened the door and stepped into a world that still shook itself dry. He walked the yard with a slow eye. The earth was soft, pocked with new prints. He saw a boot heel half set, then slid by rain, square toe. The creek carried a skin of foam and broken twigs. Near the stoop lay the brass cap from a cigar, stamped with a neat letter C. He had put one like it on the stove shelf the night before. This one had the same nick in the rim. He picked it up and set it in his pocket. By the time he came back in, the dress had been pinned better. Naya sat in the chair with her back long and her jaw calm. Her hair had dried into a heavy rope over one shoulder. There came a knock he knew by the rhythm. Not a fist, the heel of a hand. He kept the rifle on the table and opened the door halfway. Seth Romer stood with rain spots on his hat and a folded broadside in his hand. He was the only rider in Prospect Bend who delivered messages, because he did not drink them first. "Morning," Seth said. "Word from town." Reed took the paper. The ink bled a little from damp. Crane Consolidated offered $20 to each man who rode against cattle thieves and raiders north of the ridge. The handbill called for a muster at the livery. Luther Crane's name sat in the bottom corner like a signature on a deed. "Busy day at the Telegraph," Reed said. "Etta has not stopped since sunup," Seth said. He glanced past Reed and saw the woman in the chair. He had the good sense to act like he had not. "You should know there is talk about your parcel, about ore seams that run like a string of coins. I do not swear to it, but a banker who smells silver does not usually leave the scent alone." "Tell Etta to drink water and rest her hands," Reed said. "Reed, tell her." Seth nodded and left it at that. His horse's shoes rang on stone as he turned out of the yard. Reed shut the door and pushed the latch. The cabin seemed smaller for the space he had chosen not to share with anyone. He moved twice around the room and took stock like he would before leaving a camp. The Winchester by the door, the Colt on the peg by the stove, the shotgun and a canvas bag of shells on the shelf, a small crate of kerosene in the corner. He unstoppered a bottle and sniffed. It burned his nose. "We can make fire in a bottle," he said. Naya had rolled to the table and watched his hands, like arrows that burn, but bottles break better. "You know how to place them." "I watched men who did," she said. She reached for the ammunition without asking. Her fingers were quick. "Do not keep all the shells together. If one goes, keep shooting." He set 3 empty bottles on the table and twisted cloth into each neck. "I will put these by the door, the window, and the stove." "Not the stove," she said. "If you miss, we cook ourselves." He nodded and moved one to the far corner, where the wall had more stone than wood. He laid the rest of the ammo in small stacks where a hand could find them in the dark. She shifted the chair and studied the lines of the room like a hunter studies wind. "Where do they see us first?" she said. "The west window." "Hang a blanket and wet it," she said. "They will shoot wild and you will see them first," she pointed. "There and there. If it happens, sit low, shoot slow." He found an old quilt and dunked it in a bucket and hung it over the casement. The room went dim. It made the sound of the rain louder. He cut the wick on the lamp and raised the window just enough to smell the weather. Afternoon leaned in with a belly full of storm. The light went the way of pewter again. Wind came down off the ridge and combed the pines backward. In the lean-to, Onyx stamped and tossed his head. The other horse, a small bay mare named Juniper, pawed the bedding and squealed. Reed checked both animals and came back quick. He told Naya what he had seen at the edge of the trees. He told her about the cigar caps and the prints. She listened with her face quiet and her knuckles white on the wheels. "Water brings men like this," she said, and she did not mean rain. By full dark, the stove burned low. Reed set the lamps on the floor and blew them to a blue coal. He took the chair from behind the table and set it by the east window for Naya. He showed her the safety on the shotgun again. She nodded and worked it herself twice. The metal clicked clean. He put the Winchester at the west window and the Colt on the table within reach. He stood with his ear near the door and let the night come in through the cracks. It came with wet wood and horses and the faint musk of men. It came with a smell that did not belong to the country at all. A sharp city note from a bottle in a vest pocket, some kind of hair oil. He held his breath and heard the hair lift on his own arms. The first sound from above was small. The weight of a man does not sound like a branch. Reed stepped away from the center of the room and looked up at the roofline. The cedar shakes lifted and dropped as the wind passed. A section near the stove sagged wrong. He raised the rifle and aimed at that dark place and held steady. The plank gave with a crack. A man punched through with both legs and fell like a sack. The roof hung up on his belt for one heartbeat and then let him go. He hit the table and rolled to his feet with a knife in his hand. Reed did not fire in the close press of wood and flesh. He slid the barrel and struck the man across the wrist. The knife went under the table. The man lunged and wrapped both arms around Reed's middle. They pushed across the room and hit the door. The latch popped and banged back into place. Reed felt the scar at his temple pull with the effort. The man had a sour smell tobacco and old sweat. A second shadow darkened the hole above. Naya reached for a bottle and struck a match with the edge of her thumbnail. The flame took the cloth and made it jump. She threw. The glass burst on the floor and the oil skittered fire up the wall and across the boot heel of the man who was climbing in. He howled and fell backward out of the hole. Outside, a voice cursed in a carry that came from a throat with authority. "Hold the roof. Hit the door." Reed recognized Ward Pike by the thick rasp. He caught the first man by the collar and slammed him into the jam. The man went soft and slid down the boards. Reed hauled the body aside. The smell of burning hair rose sharp and rank. Smoke thickened and tried to live in the room. The wet quilt at the window caught a lick of orange and then choked it out. Naya racked the shotgun and watched the door. The bar held and shook with the pounding outside. Someone fired at the west window. The glass spat into the room. Reed fired out through the ragged frame and heard a grunt and a fall. Horses screamed in the lean-to. Light flared beyond the wall and breathed as if it were alive. "Stall is lit," Naya said. Reed took one step toward the door and stopped. The pounding paused and then came again with a rhythm that meant more than one shoulder. The corner of the door nearest the latch split. He grabbed a second bottle and lit it and stood to one side. When the wood cracked, he threw the bottle at the opening and dropped flat. Flame jumped across the threshold and into the men beyond. They cursed and fell back into each other. One boot scuffed the cigar cap he had put on the shelf. It rang once on the floor and skittered into the shadows under the cot. Through the hole in the roof came the smell of wet night and the sound of orders. Ward Pike again. His voice moved people. Reed saw a shadow drop from the edge and then vanish. He shot at the hollow where it had been. The shot beat inside the room and left his ears full of fur. He went to the west window and pulled the quilt edge up just an inch. Outside, the world had turned to mark and shadow. He saw the lean-to orange the rain and felt the heat on his face even through the wall. He saw men bringing buckets that were empty and laughing about it. He saw a pair move fast and low up the creek bed that ran along the north side of the cabin. They carried something between them with both hands. The thing was round and banded with iron. "Keg," he said. Naya rolled to the eastern side to see through the other slit. She set the shotgun muzzle on the sill and let it rest there like an old friend. She did not shoot. She watched instead. The two men came up in the channel where the bank cut them just under the shoulder. Even the rain seemed to miss them there. "Wait," Reed said. He tasted the word more than he spoke it. He let the front sight breathe on his target and then move away and then back. His finger was loose on the trigger and then not. The two men reached the bend that put them 20 yards from the north wall. They looked at each other. One spoke with his head, and the other nodded. They left the creek and ran upright because the ground was open, and a man cannot bend and go fast at the same time. The man in front carried the keg close to his body. The man behind kept his hand on the rim to steady it. "Now," Naya said. She fired. The blast filled the room, and the recoil slammed her shoulder back into the chair. The trailing man lifted off his feet and fell in a shape that did not look human. The lead man flinched and kept going with the keg cocked awkward in his arms. Reed shot him in the shoulder and then in the hip. The man stumbled and the keg fell and rolled and hit a stone. It did not go. Reed worked the lever and brought the bead to the silver band. The shot cracked. For a half instant, the keg opened like fruit. White light uncoiled. Sound ripped the air in a way that made it feel thinner. The wall came toward them. The roof jumped. Something heavy took the table in the chest and drove it into Reed's legs. Fire went out like a breath blown hard. Then the night roared back full of rain and splinters and the taste of dust. The blast blew the room wide and then the rain rushed in. Reed lay on his side with the table across his legs and a high ring in his ears. He tasted grit. The wall to the north had opened into a mouth that chewed air. The fire went out in a hiss and left the smell of wet charcoal and blood. Naya moved first. The chair had rolled to the corner and stuck against a split floorboard. She pushed off with both hands and made space. Her hair had dust and spark in it. She blinked hard and found the shotgun by feel. She worked the action. The chamber clicked empty. Reed shoved the table and freed his legs. His thigh burned from a cut he did not look at. He found the Winchester and counted by touch. 2 rounds. He rose into a crouch and saw shapes in the smoke men coming at the break in the north wall. Men at the window, void men at the door that still hung by one hinge. Rain sheeted through the hole in the roof and brought the night in cold and steady. Ward Pike called to his men from outside. They moved on that voice. Reed fired once through the north gap and sent a man backward into the dark. He fired again at the window and saw a hat jump and fall. The rifle clicked on an empty chamber. He reached for the Colt on the table and found nothing. It had gone under somewhere. The door gave on the next hit. 3 figures drove through the smoke. Naya had 1 shell left in the bag by her wheel. She dropped it, swore under her breath, picked it with her thumb and middle finger, and fed it home. She lifted the barrel and fired into the first chest. Wood slapped her shoulder. The man folded at the waist and did not get up. Reed swung a chair into the second man and broke it across his hip. The third tackled Reed low and drove him into the cot. The 2 rolled. The cot broke on the second turn. Reed felt hands on his throat and hit with the heel of his hand under the man's jaw. Teeth snapped. The man yelped and pulled back. Reed reached for his knife and found it. Steel found ribs and stuck. The man went limp with a wet gasp. The room filled with men again. The chair wheels scraped as Naya backed into the corner to deny them her sides. A rope loop dropped from the opening above and jerked tight around her shoulders. She slashed at it with the kitchen blade she had pulled from the table, cut one strand, then another. A boot came down on the steel and ground it away. Hands took her wrists and tied them tight. The rope rubbed skin raw in a single breath. A heavy shape hit Reed from behind. The world tilted. A rifle stock clipped his temple and slid stars down his vision. His hands went slack. Rough hands turned him and jerked his arms back. Iron bit skin. The men smelled of cheap whiskey and old wool. They bound his ankles loose enough to walk and tight enough to hobble. Rain hammered the roof planks. The stall crackled in the lean-to. Onyx screamed once, and then he did not. Reed went still in the center of his body and then pushed that still down deep. They hauled him through the door and into a clearing that had more mud than earth. Ward Pike stood with his coat open and his face black with smoke. He wiped soot with the back of his wrist and grinned without humor. "Bring him," he said, "and the girl." They carried Naya, bound at the wrists and elbows, and set her across a saddle like a sack of grain. She clenched her teeth and lifted her head. Her eyes found Reed and held there. The riders made a line and moved out through wet pines. Water dripped off every twig. Mud sucked at hooves. The trail ran narrow along the creek, then widened at the cut past the boulder that had his mark carved from summer. Reed walked beside his horse for the first stretch, because his head spun and a man who falls under his own mount becomes a joke. At the flats, Ward Pike made them put him in the saddle. The rope at his ankles rubbed through his pants and burned skin. He did not give it his face. By mid-morning, the rain had settled into a patient fall. The town of Prospect Bend rose out of the wet with its plank fronts and its brick bank that looked like it had been dropped there from a different country. People came to doorways and stood under awnings. Some looked away. Some stared until someone told them to mind their work. A child pointed, and his mother pushed his hand down. Amos Whitlock leaned in the blacksmith doorway with a hand on the hammer he had used for 30 years. Soot and age had cut lines in his face so deep they kept water the way cracks in clay do. He met Reed's eyes and tipped his chin once. That was all. Ward Pike pulled up at the jail a squat log house with barred windows and a stoop that held the rain and gave it back in drips. Marshal Eben Rourke came out with his hat in his hand, and a look a man wears when he is over his head and knows it. He was not old. He looked older than he was. "What is this?" Rourke asked. "Cattle thieves, raiders." And the man who fed them, Pike, said, "We will keep it clean." "You will not keep anything," Rourke said. His voice carried because the rain had pulled the town tight and quiet. "They go in cells. We wait on Judge Thatcher." Pike smiled in a way that did not change his eyes. "Mr. Crane will want a word." "Mr. Crane can have as many words as he likes from the street," Rourke said. "Get them inside." They dragged Naya down. Her legs would not help her. One of Pike's men took her by the wrists and pulled like he handled a sack. Reed stepped and would have driven his head into the man's face if 2 others had not held him. Dr. May Ellison came from the boarding house across the street with a satchel and a look like a blade. "Hands off," she said. "You tear a shoulder like that and she will never lift a cup again." Dr. Pike said with the kind of politeness a man uses for show. "Put her on a door," May said. "Carry the door." Rourke nodded and sent a deputy to the alley for a plank. They moved Naya proper. She kept her face flat and her jaw set. Reed caught her glance. She lifted her hands a half-inch. The rope line had cut flesh and made a small fan of blood. He breathed in and took the blood into himself as a kind of pact. Inside the jail smelled of damp wood and iron that has been touched by many hands. Rourke put Reed in the first cell on the right and Naya in the last on the left. He left their bonds on until the bars were between them and the world, then cut rope at the wrists. He held on to the iron cuffs at Reed's ankles. Reed sat on the cot and let the room stop moving. Luther Crane entered with a clean coat and a hat that had never met weather. He had a banker's mouth and good boots. He did not look at the floor where men had dripped onto it. He looked at people as if they were ledgers. Marshal Crane said, "We will have order." "We have it," Rourke said. Crane's gaze slid to Naya, then to Reed. His eyes paused on the broken skin at Reed's temple and the mud on his shirt. He said nothing about it. "The town advertises a reward," Crane said. He tapped the broadside with a folded finger. "It expects cooperation." "The town has a judge," Rourke said. "You get cooperation when you keep to that." Crane smiled in a way that passed for friendly among men who talk in rooms with carpets. "Of course. Judge Thatcher rides in a week. I want the prisoners secure. Every hour." "They are not going anywhere," Rourke said. Crane left the smile on his face and let his eyes walk the cells again. He turned on his heel and went out into the rain without a drop on his coat. Ward Pike followed without looking back. Dr. May stepped into Naya's cell with Rourke's small nod. She cleaned the rope burns with water and a tincture that bit. She cut the worst knots from Naya's hair and laid a folded cloth at the base of her spine where the bruise had gone yellow and green under old damage. She turned to Reed and ran fingers across his scalp. "You will have a head like a drum for a day," May said. "You will live." Reed watched her hands. "Thank you." She shrugged like it cost her nothing and everything at once. "Amos is coming with food. Eat when it is warm. Do not save it." Etta Bloom's telegraph shack sat 2 doors down from the jail, and a wire ran like a vein from there to the barracks at Fort Garland and beyond. The key clicked all afternoon. Etta worked with her lips tight and her hair pinned sharp. Seth Romer came by twice to carry notes to the marshal. Late in the day, Etta folded a slip and slid it to Dr. May, who slid it to Amos at the pump, who tucked it under a horseshoe on the blacksmith wall, until the light went gray, then carried it to the jail in his hat. Rourke stood in the doorway and read the slip with his mouth shut. Then he nodded once and put it in his pocket. Reed saw the outline of letters through wet paper. Garland. Scout. Riding. At the far end of town, the warehouse behind Crane's bank lit lamps at dusk. Men in coats carried timbers inside and brought them out with holes drilled clean. They shaved edges with a plane and fitted pegs. Rope came off a spool and lay in coils with a neatness that spoke of habit. Ward Pike smoked and watched and did not lift a hand. Night thickened until the jail took on the feel of a ship in fog. The lamps burned low and gave more shadow than light. Deputy Collins took the late watch with a cup that steamed and a slice of pie on a plate. A boy could be bought with pie. Reed thought it and then put it away. Amos brought bread and ham and a jar of peaches, then left with a handshake through the bars that took longer than it had to. Etta walked by the window once on her way home and did not turn her head. Dr. May put a folded blanket under Naya's heels. Rourke made a last round and pulled the door tight and set the bar. The jail settled. Reed lay on his back and watched lamplight move along the ceiling. The rain had thinned to a whisper. The iron on his ankles felt warmer where skin had learned its shape. In the other cell, Naya's breath found a slow rhythm. He matched it without meaning to. Sometime after midnight, a new sound slid into the room. Not rain, not wood, leather on plank. Reed turned his head and looked toward the office. The lamp there had gone down to a wick coal. The glow made a cup of light on the desk and left the corners black. Collins lay on the floor behind the desk with his eyes open and not seeing. Dark ran from his hair into the cracks between boards. 4 men came in soft with bandanas over their mouths. One moved like he owned the floor. He did not hurry. He went to the peg by the door and took the keys without a sound. Reed rose to sit, the iron bit, and spoke. The man with the keys turned his head. Even in the dim, his eyes were fine as pins. Luther Crane lifted the ring, and the keys clicked once against each other. He smiled in a way that did not touch his face. He put the first key to the lock. The key scraped once in the lock. Crane leaned in careful and slow like a man tuning a watch. Reed set his feet and let the iron on his ankles talk against the cot frame. Naya sat up on her elbows and turned her head so she could see the doorway and the desk in one line. The coal in the office lamp breathed and fell. A voice came from the threshold. It was plain and tired and steady. "That is far enough, Mr. Crane." Marshal Rourke stood in the doorway with the shotgun at his shoulder. His hat was off. Rain had slicked his hair to his head. Behind him stood a broad man in a scout's blue shirt with chevrons on the sleeve. 2 soldiers filled the rest of the door. Their rifles were already shouldered. Crane's shoulders did not move. Only his hand paused on the key. His mouth made the shape of a smile. "Marshal," he said, "you keep a strange watch." "I keep it when a man who sent a supper sends it to the wrong stomach," Rourke said. "Collins is on the floor behind your boots. He did not spill that pie by himself." Behind the bandana, the man to Crane's left breathed through his mouth. Reed knew that breath. Ward Pike. The breathing had that saw rasp in it. Crane lifted the key from the lock and let it hang from the ring. The iron touched iron and made a small, clear sound. "You do not want to do this," Crane said. "There is a gallows ready. There is a town that expects order." Rourke shifted his weight and kept the bead where it lived. "The town expects law," he said. The scout stepped a little to the side so Reed could see him full. He was older than Reed by a handful of winters, and carried himself like a man who had crossed many miles with the same stride. He looked past Crane and set his eyes on Naya. The look was not long. It said enough. "Red Clay," Naya said. Her voice came soft and full of gravel. The scout gave a small nod. He kept the rifle low and the barrel out of her line. "Put the keys on the desk," Rourke said. Pike shifted. The floor complained under his boot. His eyes flicked once to the window where the street lay black outside. He went for his gun. Rourke fired first. The shotgun roared in the small room and took the man on the left in the chest. The blast drove him backward into the office chair and sent both to the floor. The soldier on the right fired almost on the echo. A bandana dropped. A man shouted into his own sleeve and went down hard. Crane pulled a pistol from the inside of his coat and turned. Red Clay fired once. The shot took Crane high in the ribs and spun him into the cell bars. The pistol dropped. He tried to pick it with the wrong hand and could not find the grip. Pike cleared leather, fired wild, and hit the lamp. The room went dark except for coals and the flash from a second rifle that took Pike through the shoulder and into the door. He slid down and left a streak where his back had been. He looked suddenly as tired as an old mule. Rourke stepped in close with the shotgun held low and ready. The soldiers moved to the corners and covered. Red Clay went to Crane and kicked the pistol under the desk. He bent, checked the wound with 2 fingers, then stood without looking at his hand. "Keys," Rourke said again. The word was not loud. Pike took a breath like it might be his last clean one and showed both palms. "Easy, Marshal," he said. "Put the iron down and I will tell you who ordered what." "You bring that talk to the judge," Rourke said. "You do not bring it to my floor in the night." He nodded to a soldier who came forward and took the key ring from Crane's hand. The soldier moved fast and sure and opened Reed's cell. Reed stood with care. The iron at his ankles knocked the cot leg. The sound was square and small and felt bigger than it was. The soldier knelt and worked the lock. The cuffs opened. Cold air ran over the skin where the metal had sat. Rourke cut the rope at Naya's wrists himself. He did it with his pocket knife and shut the blade with his thumb and forefinger. He nodded to her and then to the chair against the wall. "Get her off the ground," he said to the deputy who had come in at the noise. The boy obeyed. His hands were gentle. Crane slid down the bars to sit on the floor. He put one hand on his shirt and held it there. Blood seeped through his fingers and found the crease in his vest like it had always been meant to go there. "You think this makes you a hero," Crane said. He spoke to the ceiling. Rourke did not answer that. He looked at what was on his floor. He took a breath that hurt and steadied it. "Get Collins covered," he said to the deputy. "Fetch Dr. May." Red Clay kept his eyes on the open doorway to the street and spoke without turning his head. "The wire reached me before the rain left the pass," he said to Rourke. "Amos sent a boy to ride. Etta sent the rest." Rourke flicked a look at Reed and then at Naya and back to the scout. "I hear," Rourke said. "I should have heard sooner." Amos Whitlock appeared in the doorway with his hat in both hands. He took in the room in one shot and then stepped aside. 2 men from the livery stood behind him, hats low. They had no guns in their hands. They did not need them to be seen. Etta Bloom stood in the street beyond with her shawl pulled tight and her hairpins catching rain. Dr. May pushed past them all. She knelt by Collins first and closed his eyes with her thumb and the base of her hand. She went to Crane next. She tore open the shirt and pressed dressings with a speed that did not look hurried. Crane winced, then managed a smile that had made men sign papers they did not read. "You patch me up and I will fix the mess," he said. "You sit still and I will keep you here long enough to answer questions," May said. "Try to stand and you bleed out on my boots." She moved to Pike and cleaned the shoulder with water that ran pink into the gap between boards. He watched her work with the flat look of a man who knows when he is beat and plans to talk his way sideways anyway. Red Clay turned his head to Naya. The look was direct and kind. "You stand in the middle of a storm," he said. She nodded once. She did not smile. Her hands, Reed said. The ropes tore skin. May stepped to Naya with a jar and a strip of cloth. She wrapped the wrists with a touch that made breath loosen. Outside, the street filled with more faces. Rourke stepped into the doorway and raised one hand. The crowd quieted the way a field of birds goes still at the shadow of a hawk. "Go home," Rourke said. "There was an attack on my jail. The men who did it are on the floor and in my custody. You want to help be here when the sun is up to put your names on a paper as witnesses, or you can go back to your beds and pretend you lost your hearing." Amos moved to his shoulder. "Put my name first," he said. Etta's chin lifted. "Put mine second," she said. Rourke nodded. He turned back inside and shut the door. He looked at Reed across the room. There was something new in his face. It was not softness. It was resolve. "You two sit for statements when the doctor is done," he said. "Then you get blankets and better light. You stay in my sight." Reed nodded once. He looked at Crane, then at Pike, then at the empty place on the floor where Collins had fallen. He did not say a word. Red Clay spoke low, so only Naya and Reed heard him. "The governor's office knows," he said. "The fort knows. The judge will ride with a guard. Things have a shape now." Naya let out a breath that she had been holding for hours. It left her at once and left her eyes wet and clear. Rourke sent for deputies from their beds. Men came rubbing sleep and carrying belts. He set one at the front door and one by the rear. He told the boy to light the lamps and keep them high. He took statements from those who had seen what mattered. He wrote slow and careful and read it back in a voice that did not leave room for confusion. May checked Reed's head and wrapped a strip around it that made him look like a man who had fought and kept his feet. She gave Naya a cup with a measure of something that warmed and calmed. Naya tasted it and drank. Her hands stopped their small ticking. At the back of the room, a pair of men lifted the dead with care and carried them to the undertaker. Rourke watched the bodies go with a face that marked the cost and moved on. The sky outside the barred window had the color of zinc. The rain had eased to a fine thread that drew a line under the eaves. Amos returned with a wheeled chair that had seen good use and good repair. He set it beside Naya with his hands on the grips, as if he would not let it roll until she told it to. "Borrowed from the shop," he said. "It turns right and does not argue." Naya touched the rim and nodded. "Thank you," she said. The words had weight. Amos tipped his hat. "You are welcome," he said. He looked at Reed and then at Rourke. "You need men on the door call. I will bring a hammer and a temper." Rourke wrote his name on a list and tore the edge of the page to keep the line honest. Red Clay stood near the office desk and unrolled a paper with an official seal. He put it where Rourke could see it and where Crane could not quite reach if he tried. The seal was clean. The ink was strong. "It names me as Special Investigator," Red Clay said, "tied to the governor's office, tied to the fort. It gives me the right to ask questions and the right to stand in the room when answers come." Rourke nodded once. "You stand," he said. Crane coughed and turned pale. He stared at the ceiling and then at the inner bars of the cell across from him, as if the iron could be bent by a look. "You make a story," he said, "to no one and to everyone. You make it and feed it to men who like to chew on other men's work." Rourke looked at him. His eyes were not angry. They were simply done. "No," Rourke said. "We write what happened and put signatures to it." The street began to lighten. The rain found a slower pace. The air in the jail took on that washed smell a town gets just before morning smokes its first breakfast. Reed stood and felt the ground under his boots as something he could claim. Naya sat in the chair and tested the bearings with a small forward roll and back. The wheels hummed clean. Rourke went to the desk and set the keys down where he could see them with one glance. He took up a clean sheet and dipped the pen. He did not lift his eyes. "Names," he said. "We start again. We put it on paper. Morning washed the street clean and left a shine on the boards. The bell at the little church rang once. Riders from Fort Garland eased into Prospect Bend with their mounts blowing steam. Judge Horace Thatcher came in a wagon with the canvas rolled back and a clerk at his elbow. He stepped down in a plain coat and held his hat in his hand. He had a face that had seen more words than weather. Rourke met him at the jail door. Red Clay stood a half step behind with the paper that named him. The judge looked once inside and frowned at the place where Collins had fallen. He did not speak about it. He told them to move to the hall by the bank because the jail smelled of blood and men. They set benches and a table. People came and stood in the back and along the walls. Amos wiped his hands on a rag and took a seat near the front. Etta kept to the side with a notebook and a pencil short as a thumb. Dr. May sat Naya near the table and checked the wraps on her wrists. Reed took the chair beside her. His head bandage itched. He did not scratch. Ward Pike sat under guard with his arm in a sling and a stare that tried to talk. Luther Crane lay in a cot by the side door with a sheet up to his chest and a fever cut into his mouth. He watched in a way that counted. Thatcher called the room to order without raising his voice. He took the sheriff's oath from Rourke and the appointment from Red Clay. He read the broadside that promised pay for raids. He placed it on the table. He called Amos first. Amos told the room what he had seen in words that did not add spice. He spoke of men moving timber in the warehouse at dusk. He spoke of rope and pegs and a frame no one had asked for. He put his name at the bottom of the paper. Rourke slid across the table. Etta stepped up and read from her own notes. Messages sent, names signed, replies from the fort. The wire clicks lived again as she spoke. The judge nodded along and asked one question about time. She answered without looking at the page. Dr. May laid out injuries and instruments. Rope burns on a woman's wrists, a head cut. Powder burns on cloth at the jail doorway. Collins dead from a blow to the skull, a bullet in Crane high and right. She did not say whether that pleased her. She spoke of facts. Rourke stood with his hands flat on the table and gave his own account. The supper sent at the wrong hour. The watch he kept in the dark. The shot that broke the quiet. His voice held when he spoke about Collins. It held when he spoke of keys in Crane's hand. He signed his name with care. Red Clay gave the governor's writ to the judge and then spoke of treaties and survey lines as if he placed stones in a stream. He told how the fort had watched Crane men mark land that did not belong to them. He pointed to a map and drew a finger along the ridge where ore might lie. He did not look toward Naya until he was done. When he did, he set the moment down gently and moved on. Thatcher turned to Pike last. Pike tried to lean on old favor and new fear. The judge let him talk until the words began to repeat. Then he held up a hand. The room went still enough to hear the horses outside stamp and shake. Enough, Thatcher said. He wrote 3 lines. He read them out like simple sums. The charges of harboring and resisting fell. Reed Calhoun and Naya Blackbird were free. The court bound over Ward Pike on counts of assault and attempted murder. Crane's holdings would be examined by territorial auditors. The fort would keep guards at the jail and the bank until that was done. He banged a gavel that had a nick in its face. The sound was wood on wood. People stirred and let breath out. Amos put a hand on Reed's shoulder. Etta smiled once and then put her pencil back to work. Crane closed his eyes. No one read his face. Rourke returned to the jail and brought back 2 things. He set Reed's Colt on the table and pushed it across with one finger. He laid a folded oilcloth bundle beside it. The Winchester rested inside. He kept his gaze steady and his voice plain. "Keep them out of town," he said. Reed nodded. "I will." Rourke looked at Naya. "You need a chair that fits. Amos can change the height on the rims." Amos lifted a hand. "Bring it by the shop after noon. I will make it turn on a dime." They left Prospect Bend at first light the next day. Juniper pulled a small wagon with boards and a barrel of nails that Amos had thrown in without counting. Etta sent 2 quilts. Dr. May wrapped food and a bottle that warmed better than coffee. Red Clay rode with them to the fork and then turned his mount toward the pass. He tipped 2 fingers off his brim to Naya and Reed. The ridge road had shed most of the rain. A soft give remained under the pine needles. The cabin at Raven's Ridge stood with its north wall torn and the roof puckered where the fire had licked. The lean-to was black and thin and empty. Reed stepped down and let his hand rest on the charred beam. Juniper shook her head and blew as if the place was a horse that needed soothing. They walked the ruin in a slow circle and spoke little. Reed pulled the iron nails from the good timber and straightened a handful with a few taps on a flat stone. He set a fresh string line and measured a door frame wider by the span of his palm. Naya sat with a pencil and a scrap of paper and sketched a ramp that ran easy. When she wheeled up the first rough plank, it held under her weight. The sound from the rims was a clean hum. By noon, the yard smelled of cut pine and hot iron. Amos came before the sun moved far and brought hinges that swung true. He set a nail on the anvil and flattened the head with 3 exact strikes. He reached into his pocket and set a small brass cap on the stump beside the anvil. The cap wore a neat letter C. The light caught it and made it look like a gold tooth. "Want it gone?" Amos asked. Reed nodded. Amos fed the cap to the heat and drew it out soft. He peened it flat over a nail head until the letter vanished into shine. He held it up between 2 fingers and grinned for the first time in 2 days. "Use this one for the place that holds the pouch," he said. Reed set a new peg by the door when the frame stood. He hammered the brass-headed nail in with a careful hand. The beaded pouch that smelled of cedar and sage went back on the wall. The scent threaded through the sharper smells of wood and smoke. Naya watched him do it and did not speak. Evening came without thunder. The river talked in the trees in the same low voice it always used. Smoke rose true from the patched stovepipe and went straight up for a time before the wind took it and made it thin. Reed stood on the new porch and rested the hammer on his shoulder. Naya rolled forward and set one hand on the railing. The boards under them felt solid and honest. He looked at the ramp and the wider door and the light on the river. She looked at the nail head that caught the last of the sun. The yard held the cut ends of boards and the smell of a day's work. A trout rose in the eddy by the bend and left a ring growing wider until it touched the reed bank and went quiet. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.